we thought that Phillip Fulmer had a lot of great things going. We agreed on that completely, but that he maybe wasn't the greatest coach out there. Was he better than Jim Don and Brad Scott, the guys of his time? I don't think there's any question, but how would he have fared against the coaching staff that are out there nowadays that are led by Kirby Smart, Nick Saban? You've got a lot of really good coaching staffs. And that was one of the things that I don't think people quite understood is that, John, when we talk about great coaches over the history of the SEC, is Phillip Fulmer going to be in that conversation? I think that's what John was kind of holding him to a standard of. He certainly, Phillip Fulmer won a championship. You can't take that away from him. So that puts him as one of the better coaches in the history of college football. But is elite? I don't think that he is. And that's what I think a lot of times John caught flack for, is he looked at him. You win a championship, you think elite, but not elite.
Well, and particularly during that time, that was still an era of a coach was a ball coach. And what I mean by that, to throw that in, it's like, okay, if they weren't a football coach of a college team, they'd be the guy that, like, if you sent your kid to a summer camp to learn football in the middle, when he was 13, they might run that summer camp. You know what I mean? They might be the guy teaching your kid the fundamentals of playing ball. That's what Phil Fulmer struck me as, a guy on the field teaching your kid the fundamentals of playing ball. But in terms of like drawing up anything creatively, analytically, thinking ahead of the curve, I never considered Fulmer that. And by the way, I don't think Fulmer considered Fulmer that. He always said he preferred Jimmy's and Joe's to X's and O's. And so
Rocky Top Tom has a strong take. Let me jump to that real quick. I'm going to put that on the board. Phillip Fulmer wasted more talent than any coach we had. Think of all those extraordinarily talented teams in the top 5, top 10, didn't beat Florida, just couldn't win the game. I really thought personally that one of Phillip Fulmer's greatest missteps, I thought there were two. I thought he lost a little bit of control of the discipline, and that showed up in the mid 2000s when players knew they could make plays and ultimately not receive tough discipline penalties if they got in trouble. The other misstep is I thought he tried to keep up with Steve Spurrier. And you're not going to keep up with Steve Spurrier scoring points. You're just not. And even if you look at what Georgia did last year to Josh Heupel, they didn't try to keep up with scoring points. They scored points because they could, but they manned up and played good defense, especially at the corner position. So, Caleb, I think that was Phillip Fulmer's misstep, trying to keep up, score the same amount of points that Steve Spurrier is scoring, when in reality, and you talk about Jamal Lewis, which I agree with you. Jamal Lewis should have been in that Florida game. What was it, his freshman year?
97.
Yeah, nice. And it was Mark Levine instead. But if you go back and look, I think Mark had 9 carries. The whole theory, big picture, whether it's Jamal, Bo Jackson, or Mark Levine, should have been run the ball 28 times at a bare minimum, or 38 times at Florida, and keep their offense off the field, especially with very good offensive lines that could have done so.
And you saw that the next year, because I know Florida made a lot of mistakes in the game, but Fulmer.
But because they had to, because they didn't have Peyton Manning, I think he should have figured that out before losing a Heisman Trophy. We should be winner.
Well, and also one of the underrated things that no one talks about is between 95 and 98. One of the things that's missed about the latter years of Peyton Manning was that if there were two subpar years of offensive line play at Tennessee's peak, it was Peyton Manning's junior and senior year. Because in 96, a lot of the offensive line from 95 was gone. That was the not Bubba Miller. Was it Bubba Miller? But either way, the Jason Lehman and those guys, in 95, they had left after 95. 96 was rebuilding. And then 97 was that youthful offensive line, the Kosi Coleman people. They didn't really emerge until 98. So when you have a bad offensive line and you're facing a Bob Stoops defense with Javon Curse as your primary rusher, that's a bad combination.
I agree. I agree with that completely. I still think they could run the ball, and I think you would agree with this. They could be a little bit more balanced, and instead of trying to throw it around with Steve Spurrier and the offense that they had. So let me ask you this. It's a little off topic, and I want to get to the offensive line and everything else that's on the show, but how would Fulmer fare if he were in his prime? How would he fare against the coaches that are in the SEC right now?
Oh, it'd be disastrous because it was disastrous, and that's why he got fired. And what I mean by that is Fulmer lost his edge. Look, let's keep this real simple. Fulmer lost his edge when
Now, let me make sure. I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me make sure we're on the same page. He's in his 40s. He's in his prime. He's hungriest. He's not letting guys get away with stuff like he did in the 2000s.
It still wouldn't matter.
Okay.
Fulmer was again, Jimmy's and Joe's over X's and O's guy. You can't be that at Tennessee when Georgia and Alabama are rolling, because guess what? You build your program. If you're Jimmy's and Joe's over X's and O's, you build your program with Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina talent. But you can't really out-recruit those guys right now. You can't. I mean, I'm sorry. Tennessee wants to get into Georgia and win some battles. But, Dave, as long as Kirby Smart's there, Georgia will always win more of the battles. That's not changing anytime soon. Alabama's always going to win more of the battles as long as Nick Saban's there for Alabama kids. So to think that you can just be better than these schools by out-recruiting them, you can't. You only got away with that in the 90s because Alabama and Georgia were down in programs.
Yep. Rocky Top Tom said, I said it for decades, Fulmer rode the wave of success, which Johnny Majors laid the groundwork for. Anyone could have won a title within 10 years at UT with the pre-work Majors put in the building. I will say anyone could have had immediate success. I think, Tom, that's selling Phillip Fulmer short. I mean, he recruited all those guys that won it in 98. I think that's selling him a little short. And let's be honest. Yeah, we've talked about some really duds as potential coaches. I mean, as it turns out, John Gruden is incredibly racist. You didn't like Greg Schiano, and there were a number of reasons why, and I get that. But if you could hire, if Josh Heupel decided to go to the NFL and be the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys tomorrow, you could do a lot worse than Phillip Fulmer in his prime. Do you agree with that, Caleb?
Yes, but I'm sticking with it.
I don't think he'd necessarily win a championship against the crew he's got to go against right now, but it'd be a program that would win 8 or 9 games a year.
Possibly. But I don't know. That's a little difficult to see. Look, because Rocky Top Tom brought up Johnny Majors. Guys, the growth of Tennessee had nothing to do with Majors or Fulmer. It had everything to do with Alabama and Georgia falling off. When did Majors really get rolling? It was the 80s, right after Bear Bryant retired. That's one competition he lost. When did Tennessee hit their peak of the modern era? 1989, the year after Vince Dooley retired. It had everything to do with Vince Dooley and Bear Bryant stepping down is why Tennessee emerged in the 90s. And it was nothing more and nothing less than that, quite honestly, because Tennessee was able to go in, and you've talked about how ahead of the curve they were in recruiting around that time. They were able to go into Georgia and Alabama and really get who they wanted from those states. The minute Mark retired at Georgia, which was 2001, and the minute Alabama hired Nick Saban in 2007, and South Carolina hired Steve Spurrier in 2005, it was a wrap. Tennessee had no hope, and they kept thinking they can win by just out-recruiting people. No, you had to start thinking X's and O's and being creative at that point. And they were just so insistent, Tennessee was, that, oh, no, we're Tennessee. We can go into Georgia and get whoever we want. Well, no, that's not reality. And they had to learn that the hard way.
There's a lot of truth to that. And I think that when Tennessee decided to make a hire in Dave Clawson instead of going with a very innovative coach and turning it over to them, I thought that was the death knell. I mean, that's when it wasn't going to happen anymore. You remember who the guy was at Tulsa was running the number one. I mentioned this to you before. They could have probably hired away if he wasn't scared away by the lack of control he would have, because you have an offensive coach as the head coach in Phillip Fulmer. The guy at Tulsa that was running the number one offense for 2 straight years. You remember that guy, right?
Oh, yeah. It was Gus Malzahn.
He was an offensive coordinator. You could have got
By the way, but also brilliant offensive mind, but I know you like him as a coach, and I do too. I don't think Kiffin could have worked out long-term at Tennessee, because Lane Kiffin still was a believer in Jimmy's and Joe's over X's and O's. Tennessee was not going to win the Jimmy's and Joe's battles with Georgia and Alabama. They just weren't. I don't care if Vince Lombardi was coaching Tennessee at the time. They weren't going to win those battles with Georgia and Alabama.